Hello, welcome to Scope. I'm Waqar Rizvi. In today's edition, we're going to talk about NATO marking its 70th anniversary as the cracks within it are showing. The U.S. says Turkey's purchase of Russia's missile defense system is a threat to NATO. It also insists that Germany's energy deal with Russia is unacceptable. This is at a time that anti-Russia hysteria is once again on the rise, forcing many analysts to warn of a new, more dangerous Cold War. NATO claims it is not, however, seeking escalation with Russia. To discuss that a bit further, we're joined now by Dr. Jan Willem Honig, who is joining us now via Skype. He's a senior lecturer in war studies at King's College in London. He's joining us now from London itself. We're also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, who is a U.S. affairs expert and is also the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He is joining us from Washington, D.C. Michael and Jan, thank you both for joining us. Jan, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of NATO's 70th anniversary? How do you reflect on the history of this organization?
Well, my main reflection would be that it is the luckiest alliance in history. Every time since the end of the Cold War, when its survival seemed to be in doubt, some new international crisis emerged and it was given another lease of life. Soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was Yugoslavia, then there was Kosovo, then there was Afghanistan, and now there's the resurgence of Russia. So it is a lucky alliance, and it survived for an incredibly long time.
What do you make of the divisions within NATO now? Vice President Mike Pence going quite harshly, speaking about Germany and Turkey in very negative terms. Germany, not only about contributions to NATO, but also that energy deal with Russia, and then, of course, Turkey with this issue of the S-400s.
Well, these are significant divisions, but at the same time, those are not new to NATO. But NATO has been an alliance ever since it started in the 1949 that has had recurrent crises and divisions between Europeans and the United States. So the current issues with the Trump administration are, in terms of the divisions they create, nothing new. What is new, though, is the difficulties that the Trump administration is creating, which are not entirely necessary, which are unprecedented, in that the United States is pressing harder and disagreeing harder with its European allies than it used to be. It used to be much more the other way around, that the European allies had doubts about the strength of US support, and they created difficulties.
Okay, let's add another voice to this conversation. We're now joined by Mr. Bob, who is an international security analyst. He is joining us now on the line from, I believe, in the UK. Bob, thanks for joining us and for taking your time out. Bob, how do you reflect on NATO at age 70? As I put to Jan earlier, it does seem that there are cracks appearing within this organization.
There are cracks appearing in the organization because of what President Trump has done when he's demanded that the NATO countries actually fulfill their obligations to spend 2% of their budget on NATO. And the only country that's doing that right now, other than the United States, is the United Kingdom.
So then, Bob, what do you make of the criticism then of Turkey with the S-400, with Germany, with the energy deal with Russia? What do you make of that?
Well, you have to examine Turkey over time. About 10 years ago, Turkey was very eager to join the EU, and Germany especially was telling Turkey that they could not join as a full member. They had to join as some sort of a second-class associate member. President Erdogan made a decision at that time that rather than be a second-class citizen in NATO, they'll be a first-class citizen in the region, and they'll go their own way. So what you're seeing in Turkey is making alliances with countries like Russia because they were denied membership in the EU.
Michael Lane, what do you make of NATO at 80? What is the mood like in D.C. about this summit? Because it does seem like there are divisions which are quite public now, really, since Pence has brought them out in the open.
Yes, well, of course, this is the Trump administration's way of conducting diplomacy. They seem to, in this case and in many other cases, eschew the concept of quiet, behind-the-scenes private diplomacy. And President Trump, particularly, it seems, from the very beginning with their NATO friends and allies, prefers to conduct his diplomacy very publicly. So there have always been differences among NATO allies, not enough to tear the organization apart or even to threaten its mission and its cooperation. But one of President Trump's campaign promises was that he was going to get every member of NATO to pay their fair share. And he has been quite vocal for 2 years about those members that have not been paying their fair share. And he seems to have a penchant for particularly calling out Germany, which, of course, when we're talking about what they're paying versus what they should be paying, that's actually a very significant amount of money that NATO could be using.
On that point, then, Michael, I'm sorry to cut you off, but do you agree with Trump on that one point? Because Bob made that point earlier as well, that this is a fair criticism of those NATO countries, isn't it?
Well, I do, yes. Look, NATO has had for a long time an agreement that they would pay 2% of their budgets for defense. And I believe of the 29 countries that are members of NATO, there's only less than 10, I think the number is 8, that actually do pay their fair share into NATO. And so if every country stepped up to the plate and actually did their fair share, it would take a lot of the financial burden off the United States, make Donald Trump a lot happier, and I think it would make NATO members a lot happier. The reason that he singles out Germany time and time again is because Germany is so big and there's just such a significant amount of money at it, and Chancellor Merkel is not really stepping up to the plate in terms of quick movement to get Germany there.
Jan, what do you make of this whole controversy over fair share within NATO? Do you think the U.S. has been taken for a ride by all of the above?
Well, this is a classic problem that ever since NATO was founded, there's been recurring debates about burden sharing, and it was always claimed by the United States that the Europeans were not pulling their full weight. And so there is nothing new about this. What is new or different is that the Trump administration and Trump himself has elevated it to a single issue and is trying to basically score fairly cheap political points that it isn't fair. But one should remember that the United States is by far the most powerful military power in the world, and it comes as the price of power that you pay more towards security issues than you do if you're smaller powers. And the one to single Germany out, that to some extent it is fair to say that Germany is a major power, the major power in Europe, and it should do more. One should also then remember or think about what one spends this money on. And NATO is a particular kind of security alliance that has an interest in particular forms of security. And there remains a big question whether those forms of security and defense spending are really the best matched to what the emerging and current security threats are. So just spending more money up to 2% in and of itself is not really going to make issues of burden sharing completely go away, nor does it solve the question of whether it is appropriate spending.
Bob, I wonder, a lot of this criticism of Germany has to do with that, as I mentioned to you earlier as well, a Nord Stream 2, like that gas pipeline that'll bring in Russian energy to Germany. Do you think a lot of this has to do with that? Because there has been some direct criticism from U.S. officials about that deal. Germany needs that energy, though. So, what alternatives exist? What can Germany do?
Well, the issue of the European reliance on Russian gas is certainly of concern, but that's not the primary issue with regard to NATO funding. I believe your other guest has referred to countries contributing their fair share. Well, the NATO agreement doesn't use the words fair share. The agreement is that countries that are members will spend 2% of their budget on defense. And other than the United States, the only country that does that is the UK. And this has been a problem for decades. The last time somebody raised this seriously was President Obama, and he raised that over 10 years ago. And right now, the NATO countries still have not met their 2% obligation. And that is why Trump pushed very hard for the NATO members to contribute their 2% as they are required to by treaty. They still aren't doing that. The issue of dependence on Russian energy is an issue that concerns the United States, but that's not the reason they're concerned about NATO defense contributions. The EU is also, at the same time, talking about creating a European army.
Yeah.
The United States has advised the Europeans that if they create a European army, U.S. forces will not be placed under command of the European Union. They will have to fund it and go alone. And the EU is unwilling to pay the significantly increased cost it would take for them to create a European army that didn't include the United States. So the Europeans are in a bit of a bind. They want to create an army, but they don't want to pay for it. They want to be in NATO, but they don't want to pay for it. And raising the specter of the gas pipeline is not something that is germane to the problem at hand. The pipeline has been going, and it's been underway for about 20 years now. The Baku pipeline was completed 10 years ago. So this being raised as an issue right now, I think, is something that diverts attention from what the primary problem is, and that is the Europeans aren't putting up the money for their own defense.
Okay, so Michael, one line, Stoltenberg's speech, I believe this was the speech they gave to Congress. One line stood out for me. I'm just going to read it out to you because I wanted to get your reaction to it, if he's trying to get an indirect message to Donald Trump. He says that the strength of a nation is not only measured by its economy or the number of its soldiers, but also by the number of its friends. And through NATO, the United States has more friends and allies than any other power, end quote. That sort of then is an indirect message, isn't it, Michael, for Donald Trump, that, listen, NATO is advantageous for the U.S. as well, even with the current issues it has?
Well, yes, I interpret that sentence the same way you do. In fact, the message from Secretary General Stoltenberg was to President Trump that, look, you'll get further by conducting diplomacy among your friends in a more traditional way than you will by having the methodology that you have chosen to pursue your friends and allies over the last several years. I don't actually know that I agree with Stoltenberg on that. President Trump has been more successful than any other previous president in terms of getting the other NATO members to honor their financial commitments to the organization. And there's still a long way to go, as noted by Chancellor Merkel's announcement just a short time ago that she hopes to get the German contribution up to 1.25% of their budget by 2023. Not even close. Not a serious effort. So yes, Stoltenberg was admonishing the President Trump, that he would get further if he pursued classic diplomacy. But I'm not sure that even though he heard the message, that Donald Trump will agree with it.
Okay, so Jan, what do you make of then, and I go back circle already to these cracks that are appearing within this organization, because it does seem undeniable that Europe and the United States disagree on a lot. As Bob there mentioned, there is concern about Russian energy and the needs of Europe, obviously. Europe also disagrees with Donald Trump specifically, and not just in the context of NATO, but on the Iran nuclear deal. There's areas of significant disagreement, aren't there? And that obviously will affect NATO, won't it?
It does. I want to go back to something Michael Lane said, that this was one of the great successes of the Trump administration, that European allies are increasing their defense contributions. I think it should be noted that they were increasing their defense contributions anyway because of the changing relationship with Russia. So to say that it is just because Donald Trump, the US president, has demanded it that they've given in is a bit of a misunderstanding. What I would add to that is that really the European allies are caught in a double bind. They don't want to give in to a president they don't really particularly like and whose foreign policy they fundamentally disagree with and consider to be dangerous. So they don't want to be seen to be giving in too much to his demands, while at the same time they recognize that Russia is a problem. There's other emerging threats around the world as well, so they need to do something about their defense contribution. But they're very much hoping that the president loses the next election, and then they can go back to a more productive relationship with the United States, where the disagreements are conducted in a better climate and in a more productive fashion.
All right, we're going to go into a very short break. Viewers, ask Jan, Michael, and Bob to stay with us. We're going to continue the conversation. We're going to talk more about Turkey and NATO's own track record around the world as well after this break. Stay tuned. Back now here in the Scope, viewers. Thanks for staying with us. We're still joined by Jan, Michael, and Bob. We're discussing, of course, NATO's 70th anniversary. Bob, I wanted to bring you in and ask you then specifically on the point of Turkey and the S-400. Michael Pence, Vice President Pence, I believe, in his speech, if I'm not mistaken, did threaten Turkey in indirect terms, really, that it may be kicked out of the organization altogether if this S-400 deal goes through. Do you think that this is a legitimate concern, and would NATO really want to lose Turkey as an ally?
The NATO organization now is a combination of factors. The first is, as we've been discussing, the failure of NATO members to honor their 2% contribution that they have agreed to via treaty. The Europeans right now are expressing a great outrage that they have been talked to in a way that they didn't like. Trump was very, very candid and brutal and plain speaking when he said, pay your debts. The Europeans are used to having long, protracted diplomatic waltzes in which they talk a lot and accomplish a little. The issue of S-400 is, again, it's a derivative issue. Right now, whether the question is, does NATO represent a viable military capability to defend the NATO countries against an attack? And I think the answer to that is today, they do not. And in order to augment their ability to defend against an attack, they have to build their forces. The Europeans don't want to do that. So they're finding many other issues.
But Bob, if I may come in, because I think that's an interesting point you brought up. I do apologize for interrupting you. But Bob, many people on the other side then would turn to NATO and point fingers at it and say, listen, it was your interventions in places like Libya, otherwise, that have created instability, which has increased global insecurity anyways.
Well, I guess it depends on your definition of instability. If you believe that stability is something that's a product of having dictatorships placing their population under iron control, then you're absolutely right. Anytime you destabilize a dictatorship, it causes instability. If you believe, as most Western countries do, that democracy is the preferred form of government, when you depose a dictator, there will always be a period of instability until the country shifts its organization and management and governmental mechanisms to a more democratic form of government. I don't consider instability after a dictator has been opposed or deposed as being something that's inherently bad. It's something that is logical and expected. The question is, over time, will those countries that have had their dictatorships deposed, will they embrace a more open democratic form of government? And in some cases, we're seeing some of that. In other cases, it remains to be seen whether that will happen. So you can't just simply say, because there was a military intervention and it destabilized an existing government, that was bad, if you believe in democracy as the preferred way of running a country.
Michael, what do you make of that? Because, I would disagree, Bob, and I'm sure Bob, has realized that I disagree with him at this point, because, Michael, people would say, listen, you create this sort of instability, and I'm going to take Libya as an example, because then that has affected Europe drastically because of the flow of asylum seekers, A, and B, the issue of ISIS and terrorism growing out of such instability. We can talk about Iraq as well, for example. So, all of this military intervention Has it really been advantageous? Has it been a black stain on NATO, do you think, Michael?
Well, let me say I agree with Bob 1,000% philosophically in the way he laid out the argument, the preference of Western countries for true democracies and for the stability of the population, stability of almost everything in the region when you have a elected democracy. However, when you look at the specifics of Libya in the real world, it doesn't seem to be working out that well. The reality on the ground is that the Obama administration had sort of a half plan there. The plan was to depose the government, but the West has been completely unsuccessful in terms of assisting that country in restoring a government that is representative of the people and able to join the international community. Libya is now listed as a failed state. So when you take these actions to philosophically pursue what is an ideal goal, I believe that you need to take into account the realities on the ground, modify your plan accordingly, and that appears to be something that we haven't done.
Jan, what do you make of that? Because, it's said a lot that, and it's always put, that question is put forth, that who made the U.S. the world's policeman and moral authority, really? And then this, I guess, can be extended then to NATO as well, when it comes to Libya or any other such interventions, be they military or otherwise. Jan, who made NATO the world's policeman?
Well, it was made by virtue of the military power, but also the political power and the political ideological power that it represents. That NATO is not simply a military alliance that vies for supremacy and power terms over the world, but it is an ideological political alliance in terms of an alliance of democracies, and therefore it has an interest in the world, in that it wants to see a world of peace. It wants to see a world that believes to be, it wants to see a world of democracies, as it believes that democracies are more inclined towards international peace than other types of regimes. So it has pursued that kind of agenda. Now, interventions create reactions, and where NATO may have gone wrong, although one can disagree over the political agenda, but where NATO has gone wrong is that, and particularly the United States within NATO, with the 2003 invasion of Iraq as the prime example, but it also applies to Afghanistan, where they've gone wrong is assuming that the rest of the world would easily be swayed by the political agenda, and that the establishment of of democracies supported by free market economies would be a relatively straightforward thing to achieve. What the experience of the past 18, 19 years has shown, that is in practice extremely, extremely difficult. That the early phase, toppling a regime, is very easy, but then building democracy, building a better regime, building a better economic infrastructure turns out to be a very great challenge. And it is a question whether NATO, as a fundamentally military alliance, is the type of alliance that is best placed to do this most important phase of rebuilding countries where regimes have fallen and new possibilities are emerging.
Bob, I wanted to give you the chance, of course, to respond to all of the above and my own criticism. I wanted to add this on, Bob, if you allow me, is that do you think NATO and even the U.S. within NATO and other countries as members of this alliance, do you think they almost look down upon the rest of the world in a sense, and they feel like they are on a higher level of moral authority, and then that sort of attitude is what's hurting them most, that they're not really strategizing and or looking at the realities on the ground, as Michael there said?
Well, there's a couple of points that we have to address here. The first point is you've alluded to the intervention in Libya as a NATO operation, and it was not. It was a bilateral intervention initially by the French, with the British following very quickly behind it. The U.S. led from the rear, according to the vernacular at the time, but that was not a NATO operation. It was an operation conducted by member states of NATO, but not by NATO as an organization. The question of whether NATO looks down on the rest of the world, I think is pejorative. NATO recognizes they have military power and they have the ability to exert that military power when they decide they want to do it. That doesn't mean they're looking down at the world. It means they're looking at ways they can use that force for good. That's one of the British government statements time and time again, a force for good, a force for good. So NATO is not an imperial organization. It's not like the Roman army where they're looking to conquer territory and bring it under the control of some central government. They intervene when they feel, one, that they can, and two, that they can achieve something. And of course, because it is an organization that is led by people and consists of different nation states with different national desires and strategic objectives, many times NATO appears to be erratic or chaotic or disorganized. Well, that's more a product of the conflicting strategic objectives of the member states than NATO as an organization. And we have to be very careful to remember that NATO is not like a unified military force under control of one country. It's a voluntary force in which consensus rules how that force will be applied, and consensus is achieved by all of the NATO membership, not one state.
Michael, I wonder what you make of that, because then, this whole issue then with Russia comes into play, doesn't it? Such a large military alliance would obviously clash with the likes of Russia, which also sees itself as a large military power in the world. Do you think that's a natural clash, a natural butting of heads that will continue to occur? But then there are major risks at play here, aren't there, Michael?
Well, I believe it will continue to occur. It doesn't necessarily have to, but if you go back and what was the purpose of NATO in the first place when it was formed back in 1949, it gave the Western countries of the North Atlantic the opportunity to have a single bloc to defend, at that time, even against what was perceived to be Russian aggression. That mission hasn't changed much over the 70 years. And certainly the situation on the ground, although it's ebbed and flowed a little bit, we find ourselves right back in the situation where the renewed emphasis on NATO's importance, on the cooperation of NATO states among each other, is being, again, driven primarily by Russian aggression. So some things never change. It could. I believe that President Putin doesn't need to be the outlier that he chooses to pursue, but he looks at what the interests of the Russian state are, finds them to be contrary to what the viewpoint of NATO members are, and so we find ourselves locked in the same kind of conflict that we've had over time. It would be nice to hope that the future would bring something different, but certainly it's not going to be in the near future. We're going in the wrong direction, not the right direction.
Jan, I'll give you the final word. Do you think it's fair to put this on Russia's shoulders / Putin's shoulders, these tensions between Russia and NATO countries? Because, the Russians would turn around and say, listen, you keep expanding closer and closer to our borders. And obviously that there are many spheres now around the world where these two organizations, or I should say one country / military alliance, disagree, be they Venezuela, be they Syria, be they a number of other spheres really around the world. It's not just Russia's fault, right?
Well, Russia has undertaken a number of foreign policy initiatives that within the modern international system are problematic. The way Crimea was taken, the intervention in Syria on behalf of a not particularly attractive regime, those are actions of a country that do not necessarily help build the kind of stable order that I would imagine most people around the world would want to see. So Russia has a big hand to play in this. And NATO has tried to maintain relations with Russia to keep the dialogue going. And in that context, you can also see the Nord Stream project, that it is part of an attempt to continue to bind Russia into an international community through the deepening of economic relations. And that makes a fundamental difference with the Cold War. when communist Russia, the Soviet Union, did not really want to engage economically or in any meaningful form, in peaceful form, in world diplomacy. That makes Russia now and China, which we haven't talked about, different. That does mean that the relationship, because there is a mutual dependency, there are opportunities of improving it, and there are losses for both sides if the relationship does not improve and a new Cold War re-emerges.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that. But of course, we appreciate all of our guests, their time, analysis, and insight. Let me thank them one by one. We were joined there by Dr. Jan Willem Honig, who is Senior Lecturer in War Studies at King's College London. We were also joined by Mr. Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He was speaking to us from Washington, D.C. And we were also joined by Mr. Bob Ayers, who is an international security analyst, and he had been speaking to us on the line from the UK. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, we started off with reflecting on the track record of NATO, especially now that it is marking its 70th anniversary and what it has achieved or lack of, possibly, according to some arguments, over these decades. Then there's obviously a talk about tensions within this organization, be it Turkey, be it Germany, and then obviously the long-standing rift with Russia, which is not a NATO member, of course. And then obviously there's talk about NATO's track record around the world as far as its military interventions go as well, be it Libya, be it Iraq. And as Bob there mentioned, NATO didn't officially sign on to Libya, but it was its own member states that went in after all. So they did get some sort of a green light, of course, to be able to do that. And there was talk, of course, about Russia's own actions around the world and whether NATO is right to want to counter Russia. That's, of course, an argument which we will leave for another day. In the scope here. We'll leave it there at that for this topic, though. Don't go anywhere. I'll be back after a short break with our next segment. Welcome back, viewers. We're now going to talk about Algeria, and the long-standing leader there has obviously given in to protesters and the army by resigning. For those out on the streets, though, this is not enough, as they claim Abdelaziz Bouteflika was representative of a political clique that must be removed. Whether the army will allow for the latter is questionable, as it will prefer stability. Some say the example of Egypt stands tall as a warning to what may be to come in Algeria. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Dr. Yahia H. Zoubir, who is a senior professor of international studies and international management. He's also director of research and geopolitics at the Kedge Business School. He's joining us now from Aubagne in France. And we're also joined by Dr. James M. Dorsey, who is an award-winning journalist and a senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Singapore's Nanyang Technological University. He is joining us now from Singapore. Yahia and James, thank you both for joining us. Yahia, I wonder what you make of Bouteflika's resignation. Is it as big a deal as we may think it is? He was an old man, to be fair, so this would have been coming anyways.
Yes, it was coming. It shouldn't have come to that point because most people were already asking for Bouteflika to resign on health issues, on the grounds that he could no longer rule the country. In fact, as of 2013, his last speech to the nation was on May 8, 2012. And then he had his stroke in 2013 and hasn't appeared except occasionally to the population. And there were some calls in the where people were saying, he should resign. He's too old. And so it became quite difficult for people to accept the indignity, because it was all, the role of dignity here has played a very big role. People saying, how could we be ruled by a handicapped person? And there were jokes about it, about the chair, the wheelchair. And it started becoming really horrifying to the population that someone like that could still remain in power. And I think on 10th February, that was the turning point when he announced, or his clique announced, that he would be running for a fifth term. They had a campaign manager and so on and so forth. And that is the stroke that broke the camel's back. Okay. People were totally against it. And this resignation is not the end of it, since that is the question, and I'm sure you're going to talk about that.
Yes, indeed. And James, I wanted to, in fact, ask you just what happens now, because, it would be argued that Bouteflika just became at some point just a puppet for this clique behind the scenes that controls real power within the country.
I think that the comparison with Egypt that you drew at the beginning of this program is partially correct in the sense that you have mass government protests and the military ultimately decides that the best way to try and maintain power is to give in to the immediate demand, which is the resignation of the head of government or the head of state. Now, whether that also means that you're going to see a similar development as you saw after the toppling in Egypt of Hosni Mubarak, namely an election that then was overthrown in a military coup, I think remains to be seen. That's where you see the differences between Egypt and Algeria.
But to be fair, James, if I may come in, but do you think it's a fair concern, though, that some people may have?
It is a fair concern, of course it is. But the difference, I think, is that you had a far greater, a closer relationship in Egypt between the Gulf states, which were determined to roll back the achievements of the 2011 popular Arab protests than you have in Algeria. Okay. That's not to say that the Gulf states, and particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, will seek to strengthen the current regime rather than see it undermined.
Yahia, what do you make of the army's role in all of this? Obviously, the army at this said that it is, with the people on the streets. It wants their voices to be heard. Will the people, do you think, be testing the army's patience going forward? Because they are saying that it's not enough for Bouteflika to resign. They want his entire clique gone.
Yes. We have to put things in perspective. The Algerian military does not play a similar role as the one that the Egyptian army plays. There are some differences there. The military is more visible in Egypt than it is in Algeria. In Algeria, it has power, but it's always behind the scenes. And, the intelligence services also played a certain role. This being said, Gaid Saleh was one of the strongest supporters of Bouteflika, and the change. There was he changed his line in view of the demonstrations. But I am convinced that within the high command in the military, they put him on notice that could not go on forever, that it was threatening the national security of Algeria. And I think this was the turning point when there was a sort of conclave. And, the letter of Bouteflika, even the letter when he says, I will resign, by the end of my term, that was no longer acceptable because, of course, Gaid was fearing for his own position because the government that was set up was by the brother, Bouteflika's brother, and the whole clique.
Yahia, I'm going to interrupt you, and I do apologize because I want to add a third voice to this conversation, if you allow. I wanted to get Dr. Milad Elharathi in on this conversation as well. He's a professor of international politics and is visiting professor as well at Cambridge University. He's joining us now from Benghazi in Libya. Milad, thanks for joining us. Milad, what do you make of what has occurred in Algeria? What is to come next in that country?
As you know, the Algerian people are also the Algerian leadership, they have an idea about what's happening exactly in Tunisia and in Libya and Egypt and Iraq and Syria as well. So Algeria, because of its geostrategic position in the Mediterranean and North Africa, so the EU is preparing themselves for this country, and the transformation should go smoothly without any trouble. This is one thing. The second thing, that the Algerian leader Bouteflika, he was sick, for 7 years, and there is other elite, leading the system in Algeria. This is one thing. The second thing, the Algerian people had paid the price in the 90s. So I think the Algerian today playing a very different scenario from Tunisia and Libya. And then the military is protecting the country from any mass destruction in the country and the state. So Algeria, it seems to me, is playing, reducing a new phenomena of political transformation in the region.
So Milad, do you think then the concerns about whether there will be stability going forward in Algeria, do you think that's a valid concern? Do you think that this will all move peacefully forward?
Yes, I'm sure that the stability will come very soon when they apply the constitution, is, article is very clearly. And I don't think the foreign rule or external rule will play any major role in Algerian, will be very internal situation and will be fixed very soon because Algeria has a constitution, And the other thing that Bouteflika, he's a figure, he's a charisma, by the way. He's one of the Algerian Liberation Front and he's the last man. So his end should be directly very smoothly and very lightly, without any mass destruction of the country and the state institutions.
Yes, I'll give the final word, Milad, if you allow me, to James. James, do you think that all of this will move forward smoothly? Because certainly the international community, specifically, of course, Europe and those countries closest to Algeria, are looking at all of this, I imagine, with a bit of concern.
I would take a broader view towards this. Of course, everybody wants this to go as smoothly as possible. But fact of the matter is that processes of political transition take anywhere from a quarter to half a century. And they're processes of 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. So we are going to see upheavals and we are going to see difficulties. How difficult or how smooth, I think that at this point is anybody's guess.
Very well. We'll leave that at that point. But gentlemen, we appreciate, of course, all times your analysis and insight. That was Dr. James M. Dorsey. He's an award-winning journalist. He was speaking to us from Singapore. We were also joined by Dr. Yahia H. Zoubir, who is a political analyst and senior professor of international studies. He had been speaking to us from France. And we were also joined by Dr. Milad Elharathi, who is a professor of international politics, visiting professor at Cambridge University. He was speaking to us from Benghazi in Libya. Viewers, as all of our guests spoke about right now, obviously, it's a wait-and-see game to see how all of this develops going forward in Algeria. What will the army's role be? What will the people want going forward? They've already said that Bouteflika's resignation is not enough, that they want the ruling elite, who they know to have supported Bouteflika through his illness and remaining in power till now. They want the entire ruling elite out. We'll wait and see how that develops, whether the international community, be it Africa or be it Europe, gets involved as well. We'll keep a close eye on those developing situations if they're in Africa. But that's all from me for the moment. I've been Waqar Rizvi, and this has been Scope.